live. Right, I am reading out of So Moses Was Born. It is a book written by Joan Grant. She was a seer. She was able to write her far memories. She wrote 4 memory books with the memories of her previous lives. This is her 7th book. Joan Grant was alive between 1907 and 1989. She was a fascinating woman. And this book here is written from the view of Nebunefer. She is Nebunefer. He was meant to be the royal heir, but he yields the crook and flail to his younger brother, Ramoses II, and retires to the living water, which is a remote estate and a sanctuary. A lot of years have gone by, and the Pharaoh has asked to see Nebunefer. He hasn't been to the palace for a long time. We're now at the next chapter entitled Pharaoh's Daughter. The following evening I went with Penpy and Caradin to a banquet given by Astnefert in honor of Catusiel's vizier. Penpy was looking remarkably beautiful in a dress of finely pleated mist linen embroidered with gold wheat ears. In addition to a wreath of gold and silver leaves, she wore on her head a cone of jeweled mesh containing a ball of linen fiber soaked in perfumed oil. In an odd but enduringly fashionable conceit, her sandals were gilded to match her toenails, and she carried 3 blue water lilies tied with a silver ribbon. Caradin's cloak was dyed with Tyrian purple and clasped at the neck by winged lions in gold and amethyst. He was so splendid with ornaments that it was difficult to recognize him as the same man whom an hour earlier I had seen naked, except for a towel around his loins, bitterly complaining that the rich food he would be expected to eat would give him indigestion, as inevitably as the conversation would inflict him with a headache. We proceeded to the Queen's palace by carrying litter, each with 4 Nubian bearers. The curtains of yellow linen embroidered with Caradin's insignia in gold and scarlet were drawn back so that we could be seen by the crowds who lined the wide streets with apparent enthusiasm. If some of them were poor or discontented, the royal bodyguard had seen that they were hidden from us by ranks of more fortunate spectators. The palace forecourt was brilliantly lit by torches, each carried by one of the 100 Nubian pages, whose oiled skins gleamed like black granite. The carrying litters of lesser guests were ranged in double ranks before the steps leading to the entrance hall, waiting for the keeper of the Queen's household to summon them in order of precedence. Penpy and Caradin entered with a fanfare from the 8 trumpeters. I was amused to find that, as Penpy's cousin, I was allowed to enter before the wife of the master of the royal barges, but 10 paces later than the great royal scribe. My earlier experience of court etiquette had been less complicated. Except in the presence of my father, I had taken precedence of all men. The audience room, its 40 pillars garlanded with pink and white lotus, was already crowded when I made my unobtrusive entrance. Astnefert was seated beside Ramoses on a gold and ivory throne, set on a dais approached by 3 steps of polished cedar wood. Only when I saw that each guest made the formal obeisance usually reserved only to Pharaoh when he wore the double crown, did I realize how difficult it must be to touch the royal foot with one's forehead without appearing ridiculous. This gesture had been made to me many times when I represented my father, but until now I had never been concerned with the difficulties of the technique. "Penpy, you should have reminded me to practice my manners," I whispered. "How could I instruct you, dear cousin? Had you forgotten that never met Pharaoh until I could salute him with a sisterly kiss on the cheek?" Had you forgotten that I never met Pharaoh until I could salute him with a sisterly kiss on the cheek? Then if I overbalance and clutch the royal foot to prevent myself falling backwards down the steps, you will have to blush for your unclean, uncouth relation. To those unfamiliar with court, who have lived in the dusk beyond the circle of radiance shed by the royal countenance, all is forgiven. One of the fan-bearers had been eyeing me with concern. It was his duty to see that I took my exact place in the line of guests, but how could he interrupt the conversation of so illustrious a personage as the wife of the vizier? Penny just a petal of her bouquet and nudged me gently. Take your place, Neb, or the keepers who control this circus will think the sky is about to fall. As I moved slowly forward, the breath of the women behind me warm on my shoulder blades, I suddenly remembered that I had been inaccurate in claiming that I had never practiced a formal obeisance. A scene flashed vividly into my mind in the kitchen garden of the palace at Heliopolis, as Pharaoh in audience. Beside him, Sensen, the queen, determined to prove that she was old enough to play with us, draped a net which had recently covered a fig tree to protect the ripe fruit from wasps. I lavishly smeared with a mixture of soot and oil was the governor of Nubia, and with us was Ramoses, chubby and tearful because we had stolen him from his afternoon sleep to become an Asiatic prisoner. As tribute, I carried 5 collars of gold, 5 slices of melon, supported on strings around my neck, whose sticky juice made runnels down my chest before Pharaoh graciously accepted them. Sensen nearly disgraced herself by licking one, until, at a frown from Karaden, she hastily put it with the others on the offering table, a chopping block borrowed from an unobservant kitchen boy. Having completed my role as the governor of Nubia, I took up the ceremonial mace, a turnip on a stick, and became the captain of the royal bodyguard. Ramoses, realizing at last that he had been greatly honored in being chosen to play his betters, allowed me to tie his hands behind him with Sensen's hair ribbon, and was obediently crawling forward on his knees. I commanded the groveling prisoner to touch his forehead to the royal foot in abject humility. Suddenly he refused to believe in the game, and with a squeal of rage cried out, "I'm not an Asiatic," and sank his teeth into Karaden's toe. I found I had reached the second step. Laughter plucked at the muscles which fought to hold my face in a suitable solemnity. I allowed my mouth silently to form the words, "I am not an Asiatic." Now the royal foot was before me. The face of its owner was benign and remote as a gold death mask. His lips hardly moved, but I heard him whisper, "Don't bite it, Neb, for your teeth are much sharper than mine were." Nebunefers offered me her hand to kiss, a mark of unusual favor to one so unexalted. But I realized she did so only as a compliment to Penpee. She knew Ramoses had spoken, but would have been even more puzzled had she heard what he had said. Her small, pointed face looked pale under the heavy wig, each plate tipped with a gold lotus. She still had the figure of a girl, although she had given her husband 9 children, 5 of whom were still living. Later, when she was moving amongst her guests after the banquet, I saw her eyes were anxious as she looked at Meremptah, who was talking rather too loudly to a boy whose eyelids were painted with malachite. "Poor mother, she worries far too much about Meremptah," said a voice at my elbow. I turned to see a girl who resembled Nebunefer, but who had a glowing humanity that the elder woman lacked. "I'm Bintana, the eldest of Pharaoh's innumerable daughters. I find the atmosphere somewhat oppressive in here, so would you escort me to the garden?" She led me to a secluded seat under an arbutus tree. "Now that no one can see us, I can take off my headdress. Mother makes me wear it because it is fashion, but I find it ridiculously uncomfortable." She leaned back, clasping her hands around a slender knee. "Do you approve of your eldest niece, dear uncle?" While I was wondering whether to pretend to misunderstand her, she kissed me lightly on the cheek. "Dear Neb, please do not deprive me of a rare opportunity of being honest. How do I know you are my uncle? Do you really want to know? Most fervently, O wise and beautiful niece. I presume I would be wrong if I thought you knew only because Ramosis told you. I expect father knows I know, though he has not bothered to tell me so. Mother does not even suspect you are more than a relation of Penpiece, so be careful not to betray yourself. It hurts her to be reminded there are so many things father does not wish to share with her. She is sweet and gentle person, but very easy to deceive, for she seldom listens to anyone except Maremtra, and he is only interested in himself. A row of dancing girls passed smoothly along the terrace and suddenly reminded me of a frieze I had once seen on some temple wall. I was in a temple for 5 years, said Bintana, as though I had spoken my trivial thought aloud. I became a priestess of Hathor, rather a competent one. At that time, father had decided that it was too optimistic to expect a winged pharaoh in one person, so I was to be the winged part, and he was going to select a husband for me who could be relied on to be a brilliant leader of armies. It still seems a most admirable solution to the future of Egypt, I said with very real enthusiasm. But quite impractical, for a most mundane reason. I was supposed to be delicate, but I never thought anything was really wrong with me until I was 16. Then I fell down some steps and hurt my spine. Not seriously, for I could walk by the end of the year, but Thomas, father's physician, discovered that for some odd reason the bones of my pelvis are set in a way that means if I have a child, either it or I will almost certainly die. I minded a great deal at the time, but being surrounded by so many brothers and sisters makes it easier to become resigned to virginity. The music of sweet singers drifted down to us, through the night air which rustled the heavy leaves of the trees. There is nothing really destructive about virginity unless one makes a cult of it, she said. But it is a little ironical to be a daughter of Hathor, the great mother goddess, and yet barren. I also have nothing to offer, Hathor. She linked her fingers in mine. I think you're too modest, dear uncle. Ramosis has quantities of children, but still there are more at the Living Waters who think of you as their father. How do you come to know the number of people who live in my small oasis? That is what I began to tell you before we wandered into such irrelevant byways as the shape of my pelvis, which after all decided my destiny no more surely than the shape of my mother's nose. Did father ever tell you that he chose mother for his queen because she was the only woman he knew whose nose turns up a little? He thought in his children it would modify his own, which is the only feature with which he is not perfectly satisfied. Your profile is an admirable demonstration of the effectiveness of intelligent cooperation. And if that statement is not pompous enough to remind you that I am consumed with curiosity to know why you recognize me as your uncle, I shall have to think of some even more verbose pattern of words. I learned about you through my grandmother, Tua, who I am sure you remember only too well. Tua, but she is the one person who would not have told you. If you're going to spoil my story by interrupting, I shall take you back to watch the jugglers. Then I swear to be as silent as though I were in fact surrounded by the digestive juices of a certain crocodile. Hawks carved on the back of a seat look very nice, but they are uncomfortable to lean on when one is wearing as little as I am, so may I borrow your shoulders? My shoulder is greatly honored, I said, putting my arm around her. You are a very companionable person, dear uncle. It is odd that no one wanted to be born to either of us, for I think we should have been understanding to children. I felt a tear fall on my wrist, but knew she was shy of tears. Tell me about Tua, I said. I still believed in the crocodile legend even when I became quite an adequate priestess. One of the things I can do is to watch people's nightmares and see which bits are only terror patterns made from their own guilt and which were sent by Set to torture them. Sometimes, of course, the pictures are made by one of the kindly gods as a warning not to go on deliberately making themselves miserable by being unkind. The temple where I learned where I learned this, was dedicated to Hathor. Fortunately, its traditions were very dissimilar to those followed by the Amen-Ra faction. Patamas was trained there, which is why I know he's not mistaken about my need for virginity. Father did not let me stay there all the time because, in an odd way, he relies on me, and I happened to be at Thebes when Tua started to die. Mother said it was my duty to do what I could to prepare her for her journey through the underworld. To be honest, I think Mother believed that I was the only person who might be able to prevent Tua coming back to haunt us. Tua alive was sufficiently unpleasant. As an ubiquitous ghost, she would be insupportable. I tried to love her because unless I could make myself feel real affection, I knew I would produce only clever little magics like the Amen priest. But I think that all I really achieved was to feel pity for her, a very poor substitute. Pity was easy enough, for she suffered extreme pain and became so emaciated that her fingers looked like rats' claws. Her vitality was almost terrifying when one realized it was because she was too frightened to die. Even on the last morning she outlined her eyes with kohl and had her nails stained with henna. Where did she die? At Thebes, in the room where Moses was born. The only thing that had been changed were the god statues. At the foot of her bed she had a sebek in black granite, but instead of a man with the head of a crocodile, it was a crocodile with a human mask. The weather was hot, and the room became very unpleasant when she insisted that there should be rotten meat on the offering table. When she became delirious, she demanded human meat. To pacify her, we produced goat's flesh and said it was pieces of foreign prisoners that had been cut into unrecognizable chunks to avoid gossip. Gossip. I hope that gossip is a deliberate understatement. Tua requires no exaggeration. She accused Sibek of great ingratitude for having forgotten that she had already sacrificed to him a prince of royal blood. At first I thought it was only one of the concubines' babies. Poor little things. They are often apt to die if father showed too much interest in their mother. But then I realized that she thought she had murdered you and Sensen. I hope you considered it naughty of her and uttered some suitable rebuke. It would have been redundant. She was convinced that you were waiting to testify against her before the 42 assessors. She should have thought of that sooner, or at least had the wit to know that the assessors do not require material witnesses to supply them with evidence. People who try not to believe in magic are usually very illogical, Neb. You ought to be flattered that she selected you as the only one of her victims who could prevent her meeting your father again. It would be worth being eaten by a crocodile to perform such a beneficent service to Seti. And quite unnecessary. His heaven and her hell make the presence of each other impossible. The Ushapi figures she had chosen to be included in her mummy wrappings had been made in your father's image, but fortunately they were only glazed figurines instead of real amulets. She kept them in an ivory box beside her bed. Only when she knew she was dying did she tell me to open it and give her the picture I would find there. It seemed quite an ordinary picture, a young man holding a gazelle by the collar, drawn with red chalk on a piece of slate. "Here's your uncle," she said. "He would have been Pharaoh unless I had given Egypt to my son." Her mouth began to twitch, and I thought she was having another seizure. Then she sat upright and cried out, "Bintana! Bintanta! Seek him on the other side of the river and implore his clemency." She tried to crawl to the end of the bed, screaming to Sebek to protect her. I had to call one of the physicians to help me quieten her with poppy juice. I took the picture to my room and stared at it for a long time before I went to sleep. Then I saw you, looking older by at least 15 years than the artist had seen you, mending the axle of an ox cart. It seemed an unlikely occupation for someone in heaven. So I woke myself and looked in a silver mirror, which I use when I want to see something which is of earth, and is divided from me only by space, which is measured in cubits, and time, which is measured in hours. You had finished the axle and were now sitting on a wall beside a lake. Several children were bathing in it, and I remember seeing a woman plucking grapes in a small vineyard. I like being accurate about details, even when they are irrelevant, so I took the trouble to find out that you were living several days' journey south of Thebes, but north of the first cataract. You find it surprising? The only thing I find odd is how you managed to find me at the living waters, when the defenses were impregnable to use Amentu and the other priests. Dear uncle, are you not being a trifle obtuse? Magical defenses are necessarily selective. The seal of the sanctuary was simple. No enemy may enter here. I embraced her fondly. Bintana, you have lifted a burden from your aged uncle. Now that I have met you, I know there was no need for me to come here except as an inconspicuous guest. You know why I came? Not officially, but I presume it has something to do with Father's latest experiment with paternity. Exactly, and you are far better equipped than I to tell him which child, if any, is the one acceptable to Horus. So now he expects to be sent a son of Horus, she laughed ruefully. In my day, it was to be a daughter of Hathor, or should I say a granddaughter. When one tries to assess human ancestry with godly lineage, precise relationships become a little confusing. I believe such a child will be born to him, Bintana. You must help me. The future of Egypt rests in your hands. Neb, dear, I'm sorry to appear unhelpful, but the responsibility is yours, not mine. Tomorrow I leave for Punt, where one of my sisters is married to the eldest son of the governor. I have promised to stay with her until after the birth of her first child. As an unbittered maiden, aunt, I am frequently in demand. But the son of Horus is of far more importance. Not to me at this juncture. She waved to Pempi, who had come on to the terrace with Caradon. You must go now, for my elder uncle does not like to be kept waiting. Sleep well tonight, dear Neb. We will meet in the spring, when we have both fulfilled our duties to Hathor as midwives to the children we could not of ourselves bring forth. So that's the end of this chapter. The next one is called Shadow of Amen.